I'm so delighted to be joined by Professor Doug Stokes. Uh, Doug is an academic and he is a professor in international security and strategy in the Department for Politics at the University of Exeter. But we are particularly speaking to him today because he has very recently released a new book, which is called Against Decolonisation, Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. So right up our street and the kinds of things that we talk about on this podcast. And you may have seen Doug commenting and writing about many of these issues: identity politics, freedom of speech, the culture wars on campus, as he alludes to in his book. And you may have even come across his Substack, which we often read, and he has many interesting, insightful, and important takes on this really important issue shaping the public conversation at the moment. So first and foremost, thank you so much for Doug for joining me.
Absolute pleasure.
Brilliant. So we published a review actually, and I think you are aware of your book on our Substack. But for those who haven't come across it, a book that we highly recommend, by the way. So please, everybody, go out and purchase it, read it, and share it about to all the people that you know. Give us just a quick rundown of your key thesis, your key arguments.
Well, there's a number of, it's quite a broad book, but what I essentially argue is that what we've seen in the wake of the George Floyd killing and the kind of the cultural tumult that threw up, we've seen increasingly the adoption of decolonising theories and ideas. Not just within the academic community, which is less problematic ultimately, but increasingly by British institutions or Anglophone institutions actually, and in particular UK universities and by various executive teams. And these have been imposed in the name of a kind of form of social justice. So the official adoption of decolonial theory, post-colonial theory, and then imposed by executive teams, university executive teams, as a kind of new orthodoxy. We've seen this across the UK university system, and this is said to be driven by, as I say, social justice. So it's kind of a moral necessity to adopt these things, and so this obviously has incredibly deep implications for academic freedom, for learning, and a lot of these ideas are quite fringe, well, hitherto quite fringe theories, and they draw on sort of post-colonial, but post-structural and post-modern, almost post-Marxist ideas in many senses. And so the book traces that. It shows how that's developed in the UK university system and some of the social and political implications of that for academic freedom, but also for broader, our broader culture. It then critiques that move and critiques some of the ideas, and then it moves on to look at how we explain this politics of wokery, or the sort of the intersectionalism within British institutions, how we explain that. And then it ends with a chapter looking at geopolitics, and the argument I make in that chapter is that a state, the national interest, or how we understand ourselves as a civilization, as a people, as a kind of multiracial, multicultural society, how we understand ourselves fundamentally impacts upon the way in which we act upon the world. And human history is characterized by the rise and fall of various civilizations. And obviously, one of the prerequisites for some degree of civilizational confidence is precisely a belief in oneself. So the argument, I kind of end on a plea, but also to point something out, and that is, what we have in the West, which is a very multiracial, multi-ethnic, very progressive in many senses, very liberal. This is not the norm in human history. In many ways, this is kind of almost, it rests on the institutional settlement of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions. But ironically, given the anti-imperialism of a lot of decolonial activists, also America's military hegemony, which in some senses sort of generates global collective public goods and sets of outcomes that kind of benefit the global economy, which has also seen a massive rise in terms of human development, etc. But those things aren't natural, and they're highly contingent, and they're very fragile, as we see, for example, in Israel and Hamas as we see in Ukraine. There's no necessary reason why interconnectivity and liberal values will prevail. They have to be understood, they have to be defended, they have to be argued for. And obviously, human tribalism and international and civilizational conflict tend to be the human norm. So I guess the big question really is: are we returning to that period? And it's a plea really to sort of realize what we've got. These are very precious things, and we throw them away at our great peril. We may think we're kind of cool and edgy and whoa, but we throw them away at our great peril. So that's the book basically.
But there's lots to get into there, and I think that's one of the angles that I think I'd really like to explore in this discussion, which is the impact on geopolitics and our position in the world and our confidence. Because I guess your background is international relations, and it's quite interesting that you're discussing this book, and I think that is that particular angle to the book, the campus culture wars, because some people might think, how are those things related? Actually, I think it's really important how you articulated just there why our faith in our own ideals, our faith in our own values, actually is really important when we are standing up against ideologies, authoritarians across the world that are dead set on pushing other values that are detrimental to the world. So before we just get into that, I guess I think it would be just quite useful to just get your understanding of these terms, because we do hear. So what is decolonization? So because I think a lot of people historically have understood it as the removal of a colonial power from the governing systems of a particular nation. But the phrase or the word decolonization has taken on a different meaning. And if you could summarize, if as best as you could, what is post-colonial thought? What is post-structuralism? Because I still think, whilst it's been spoken about a lot of people still don't understand these things because these are academic concepts that are not necessarily the kinds of things that we think about in everyday life, even though they're having such a big impact.
Well, that's a tall order, and I don't want to bore your listeners, so I'll do my best to keep it kind of snappy and not too philosophical. Um, so, sort of decolonization really refers to the process in the formal sense. It refers to the formal sort of unraveling of the European empires in particular. Although obviously they aren't the only empires in human history, although they tend to be ironically lifted up as the kind of the only empires. So the only thing we ever talk about, the ubiquity of the European empires. Well, obviously there's huge, and from the Aztecs, the Mexican, Roman Empire, African kingdoms. You can go through the human history. It's fascinating stuff. So, but sort of decolonizing in the current sense in which we understand it, in the way it's being adopted, refers to a formal process of political decolonization by the European empires post Second World War. The British and French in particular simply didn't have the wherewithal, the capacity, the military capacity, or even the financial capacity to sustain their empires across the global south, although they wanted to. So, for example, in the various instances where they attempted to hang on, so the Brits got heavily involved in Greece, the French got very heavily involved in the attempted suppression of the Vietnamese nationalist insurgency in Vietnam in the 50s, and then the Americans gradually got sucked in part of the border bipolar competition. So decolonizing refers in the formal political sense that process of the unraveling of the European empires in particular, and then the emergence of post-colonial states, post-colonial elites, and sort of post-colonial state formation. So that's the kind of the formal political process that took place. But I think the decolonizing theories that we see now are far more playful, and they're not interested ultimately in interrogating those historical events as such. They're kind of almost parasitic on those events to invoke a sense of political frisson in the here and now. It's kind of like slightly edgy kind of activist type theories. But they draw on the development of post-structuralist and post-modernist and post-colonial theories in the academy. So this is where I don't want to turn your listeners off, because I'll try and keep it fairly snappy. But the dominant way of sort of critical framework that dominated the Western academy in the 1950s and towards the end of the 1960s really was Marxism. And Marxism itself was undergoing a process of theoretical tumult. You had kind of the more sort of heavy historical materialist, objectivist, modernist, rooted in a scientific method, Marxism. And you saw the high point of that was really Louis Althusser in the 1950s, who was a French Marxist theorist, big French Marxist theorist. He was a very important figure in French Marxism. And then, but there was also a cultural term within Marxist theory, and in particular, there was the Gramscian school. You'll often hear this invoked, this kind of the Gramsci, the idea of, the march to institutions, this kind of thing. And essentially it put an emphasis on culture. And essentially it came from the critique, well, why has there not been a socialist or communist revolution in Europe? These are the most advanced capitalist social formations, and yet we've not seen a revolutionary transformation of those into socialism. So the argument that the French, well, not the French, but the cultural Marxist left made was it's because of the sort of brainwashing of people. They're brainwashed by the media and these cultural narratives. So there was an interesting fusion then where that cultural turn in Marxist theory was adopted and in some sense kind of almost an anti-Marxist theory of post-structuralism began to emerge. So the key thinkers would be people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, but also Edward Said, who we'll come on to in a bit. But Derrida and Foucault were really the giants of the field. And their argument was it moved away from an objectivist position where the contradictions of capitalism was rooted in sort of objective relations of production. They were far more interested in human subjectivity and thoughts and ideas. And so the essential argument was the way we see the world, our ideas of the world conjure the world into being. So Foucault talked about, for example, epistemes and discourses, and he said that knowledge was fundamentally imbued with power relationships. So the way you see the world on an intersubjective basis brings into being sets of power relationships. And Derrida said that all Western civilization, Western philosophy has a theoretical dyad at its heart. There's a privileged position, so man over woman, white over black, civilized over uncivilized. And this is operative within Western civilization and Western philosophy. So you get this fusion then of the emphasis on ideas and culture, and discourses and ideology. And you also get this dyad system where you have a sort of a privileged and an underprivileged position. And you can then really begin to see how that was translated into the thought of Edward Said, who was a Palestinian refugee ultimately, but he was francophone. I think he ended up in Columbia University, but he coined this idea of Orientalism, which is a very, very dominant big theory in the decolonial, post-colonial canon. And in his argument about Orientalism was a discursive system, but the West inhabited when it operated in the Middle East and that part of the world, Levant, etc. And it had inherent to it Orientalism as captured by paintings and literature and poetry, this sense of the East as being mysterious, but also needing the parental authority of the West. So if you bring it all together, then you post-structuralists and post-colonial theorists, they have an emphasis on ideas, discourses as power mechanisms, subjectivity. They reject objectivity. They reject scientific truth. They see that as ultimately scientific truth for the post-structuralists in many senses is imbued, is kind of the epitome of Western civilization, which is the epitome of this cold scientific rationality that seeks to control the world and ends ultimately. Lyotard, for example, made the argument in the concentration camps, the end point of industrialization, the scientific method. So the sort of post-colonial, decolonial it's far more playful. It's an emphasis on culture, and it's an emphasis on the way in which our ideas and discourses can construct the world to create these privileged and underprivileged, or oppressor and oppressed groups. So that's the theoretical system. Yeah.
No, that is really, really useful, and I think I think the intellectual history, I think, is really important for
Yeah.
particularly people working within institutions, to understand that the ideas that they are articulating has roots and things that maybe they don't fully
Yeah.
agree with. and they're
Yeah.
essentially accepting these narratives wholesale without critically analyzing that many of these, this isn't the liberal democratic tradition, the very tradition that Martin Luther King and many others have argued for and successfully won major battles. We're talking about a tradition that is deconstructing many of the values that we ostensibly hold dear. I guess what do you, but before I want to continue on that particular trajectory of conversation, but before I do, I guess my instant thought as a kind of devil's advocate, I guess, would be what do you say to those who say that, look, what happened with George Floyd was was a horrific thing. And when I went to protest in BLM and on my university campuses, I was merely showing solidarity against racism. That I wasn't being a mouthpiece for post-structuralism and decolonial theory. I was just acting on my human instinct. And I guess, so, what do you say to those who might say that that this is not really that wasn't about what people were doing, and that actually people that are making those arguments are essentially trying to reinterpret that for something that they disagree with because they disagree with it rather than actually how people were responding in that moment.
Well, I would say that I think that the desire to struggle against racism is one to be supported and to be respected, and I can understand. I understand that. I mean, I completely. But I think that uh, if we look at how we have driven historically racism out of society, it's by the coming together of people from different backgrounds, classes, social classes, and different races. I mean, look, for example, at the civil rights struggle in America to sort of overthrow the racism that there, or to really push it back in the legislative and the social and the cultural and political sense. It involved the coming together of people, white people, black people, and people from all types of classes and backgrounds. And it was an articulation of a liberal position, really, wasn't it? It was rooted in a liberalism, and that is equality of all before the law. And also, it was rooted in a kind of there's lots of critiques of this, but kind of a form of our common humanity, a form of liberal universalism, ultimately. And so I think the danger in the approach that what I would say is a kind of well, if you read the critical race theorists and the decolonial activists, they completely repudiate liberalism. They see it as a smokescreen and as something to be resisted. And they explicitly are highly critical of liberalism and modernity and universalism. And my position with that would be, I think that's a very, very dangerous move. It's a very dangerous theoretical move, and it's a very dangerous political move. Because I'll be brutally honest with you, I mean, to pump out, to sort of to move from that liberalism, and then you think about all the advances that we've had in Western civilization vis-a-vis race relations, at least in the Anglophone world. I mean, if you look at a lot of the data in America, there is a common narrative about systemic, police are killing black people in huge numbers and all that. If you look at the data on it, it simply doesn't bear that out. So in 2019, I think it was like 19 unarmed black men were killed by the police. Most police interactions with black minorities tend to be kind of gun related. So even on an empirical basis, when you look at the empirical data on that, I mean, it's a really counterintuitive fact. I kind of cover it briefly in the book, but when I saw it, I was blown away by it. But most racist incidents in America, when you can control on a per capita basis, are actually carried out by black people. If you look at the data on it, look at the Department of Justice and the FBI data on it. Hate crime is on a per capita basis. So a lot of the narrative that we've had about this ubiquity of white racism against ethnic minorities and black minorities in particular, when you look at the data, is not borne out by the data. This isn't to say
Yeah.
that the racism doesn't exist, by the way, or
No, no, you don't have to caveat that here.
no,
We
no, no,
totally
no, no.
know.
But I mean, that's not but I'm saying however imperfect that liberal universalism may be, right? If you look at the advances that we've made in relation to human development, race relations, where we're at now versus where we were at 50 years ago. It's really quite remarkable. And then I think the other broader point from that is if we go back to what we discussed earlier, and that is the kind of contingent nature of our civilization. It's like, we're sat on a beach in some way, sipping a pina colada, and it feels kind of nice. The sun's on us. It's kind of, yeah, we're enjoying this, right? But none of this is natural. And a lot of this rests on the institutional settlement and certain sets of norms that are now under great process of profound and deep change. Think about
But
globalization. Sorry. Yeah, yeah,
no. I just want to come back to some
yeah,
of the things that you said.
yeah.
So I think so just going back to when you were giving the intellectual history there. So how does this why does this get adopted, do you think, within institutions? And what impact do you think that this has had on institutions? Just to give people a feel of the kind of concrete ways in which these ideologies and these philosophies have transformed our institutions.
Well, why? There's a whole series of various reasons, and I think one of the big reasons has been. I watched this thing the other day. In fact, I found it absolutely fascinating. Look at the data on it. Social media. So social media has really put a lot of this on, and the business model of social media. It does ultimately rely on a sort of clickbait type thing and increasing online tribes. So I think social media has been a big part of that. I think a lot of the discourse about the nature of racism in America, and America is a cultural hegemonic power. What goes on in America really inflects the global culture as well, as we know. And especially over here, we seem to sort of delight in importing America's ideas, cultural ideas, into the UK, no matter how, whacked out they may be or how discordant they may be with UK cultural traditions. But we seem to import, especially the so-called progressive left. They love bringing this stuff over here, and then they kind of impose it. But I think that social media has been a big part of it. If we look at a lot of the stories and the data on the ubiquity of terms like slavery and racism and white privilege and all these kind of terms, they've just gone absolutely through the roof. And it's not like we suddenly had an explosion of over Nazism in the UK. If you look at race relations, the opinion polling, it's just got better. And it's very, very settled. It's very, but so terms have gone crazy. But then I think it is this kind of, it does relate to this deeper kind of culture on the West Coast, Facebook, Twitter, and then the ubiquity of that, and then this resistance against Trump and the really very strong Trump catastrophization, and then similarly in the UK, sort of anti-Brexit machinations. I think there was a sense on the part of cultural elites and political and cultural elites in particular, and cultural institutions, very powerful cultural institutions, that the Trump's victory in 2016 and the Brexit vote over here were nascent, very strong signals of an incipient and rising extreme right populist fascism, which itself that position, which is ubiquitous, is deeply damaging to British and to UK and to US politics too. If you think about it, many of these trends are actually what I would argue would be the legitimate political agency of ordinary people against some of the big trends that we've seen in globalization, the outsourcing of jobs, the precarious nature of existence now, the workplace existence, open borders and what that means, especially for communities at the very low end of the socio-economic scale. You see what I mean? So political agency in terms of its expression about how it feels about those trends inherent to globalization are coded by political elites as expressions of fascism and incipient racism, and therefore there's a holy mission, there's a moral mission to really put this stuff on steroids, which itself then has its own really very negative external feedback loops into the social cohesion, and it puts these. Do you see what I mean? So we're having structural trends in the global economy, in the Anglophone economies in particular, in relation to globalization, which is leading to new dispensations in British politics and American politics, quite similar in some ways, the somewheres, the anywheres, the educated versus the non-educated. And what this means for the economy, what this means for politics of representation. And when we see political agency expressed in that, and it's coded in a certain kind of way, often in high demeaning ways, again, it's very, very damaging. So this is kind of what the book argues for as well. And what I think, and so this goes to a bigger picture here, right? And that is, I think, if I look at what the work you've done and Didi you have done and others have done, I may be wrong, but I think a lot of it is driven by a recognition of the importance of liberal values, and saying these are contingent values and that they should be defended, and then a fear that if we don't do that, what will the Pandora's box, when it opens, what comes out of that Pandora's box? Because this is something that I feel very strongly about. A lot of this politics that we see, a lot of this stuff that we see, it often takes place on the campus. And the campus is a very bourgeois, very safe, it's a very nice, fluffy environment. And the people there are often lovely people. But when it escapes the petri dish and you get some of these really divisive ideas and they cross certain types of lines, then where that goes is it's not as nice, it's not as safe, it's not as comfortable. And things can turn around really, really quickly. And so it's the fear of the backlash, I think that's another big part of it too.
That's really interesting. You know, I was thinking about what you mentioned about the way in which we import America's kind of racial cultures, and I think that's very true. And I think it's an argument that I've made and many others have made over the last few years. How so? Because I think you know, listening to what you've just said and others that have talked about uh, the French intellectuals and post-structuralism and postmodernism, which obviously has its roots in Europe. So, in a strange way, it is a it's not really just America, and we're not just importing America's cultures. We're also strongly influenced by these thinkers in Europe. And so, I guess my question is, this is a Western problem, as you identify in the book. You say the decline of the West, and we don't want to say this is America or this is just the crazy French. There's actually clearly something in the West at the moment that is making us vulnerable to ideas that are attacking itself, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I quite, that's a really good point. I think I read Tom Holland's book, Dominion, a while back, and I was really struck by that, in terms of how a lot of our deep cultural DNA in the West is kind of it's emergent from Christianity. And I think that there is an interesting point to be made here. If we look at where wokery or intersectionalism has really taken off the most, it's in often the white liberal US and amongst white liberals here as well, right? Both Protestant countries. It has far less purchase on the continent. I mean, France, you forget about it. I mean, forget about it. Even though a lot of the post-structuralists are, there's another point. There's a side point here. It's some of the deep ironies of France and how it can affect America. Think about this. I was doing this the other day about the Vietnamese insurgency. So Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the French Viet Cong. He was educated in France. A lot of the post-colonial leaders were educated in France. So the irony there is you've got France educated Ho Chi Minh. He went back with these secular nationalist ideas and then fought against the French insurgency, which then sucked America into France's cultural war in some ways. But anyway, let's get back. Where were we? We were talking about So I'm quite struck by that. I think that human beings fundamentally need a sense of purpose. We all need a sense of deeper purpose and meaning. We need meaning in our lives, and I think that wokery or intersectionality, it's notable that it's really taken off in the Protestant. There's a deep Protestant cultural DNA there. And so what is it about? Well, it's about we are inherently sinful. We have to sort of repudiate ourselves, confess our sins, become allies. Yeah, and
A
through
lot. There's a lot about guilt as
guilt,
well and
there's
shame. Yeah.
guilt and shame, and
Mm,
and through a process of confession and
mm,
contrition,
mm.
we can become born again as allies. And so in an increasingly secular world, where we all still, as human beings, all of us need a sense of belonging and identity and a meaning in our lives, transcendental meaning. We all need that, really. It's noticeable that I think a lot this wokery intersectionalism replaces that kind of Calvinist or that Protestant script, that deep spiritual script that lies at the heart of ourselves. And then obviously we got these online communities and faith based. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really faith based. You hear these statements that they're stated as an article of political faith. You know, we see it in the trans debates, we see it in the decolonial debates. So it's like a political spirituality that replaces our increasingly secular, post-Protestant, secular, Western liberal way of life. I think that's a big part of it.
I want to get back to what you were saying about the backlash against Trump and Brexit and the kind of class element to that. But just on that same point, I guess one of the things that I wonder with you know my arguments, but also yours and others, is that can a re-articulation of the importance of liberal values really provide the moral and cultural authority to stand up against wokeism and all these other things? Because clearly, saying making appeals to freedom of speech or making appeals to universalism has so far not been effective in holding off. And so, and I'm not trying to make a kind of God-shaped hole kind of we need religion argument, because I don't necessarily buy that. I don't know if you do, but I guess my question is that is there something that comes after liberalism? Because there is, I don't know if you've come across post-liberalism and these other discussions that are emerging, but my question is essentially, so far it has failed to um, push back successfully against the onslaught of a lot of these ideologies within our institutions. And therefore, is it enough? Even if I can appreciate what it does and what it has done, can it really confront these things? What do you think?
I think that's a very tough question, and in some ways, I have to be a mystic Meg and look into the crystal ball. I mean, I quite like the. I mean, where we're going now on the post-liberal stuff is you have people still arguing for liberalism. You have the post-liberals, and we're seeing inflections now of a return to Christianity, or in some cases, a movement towards Islam. We sort of take in. So there is this kind of like re-emergence now of sort of a religious element to it. I mean, my position on that would be, I don't. It's more about the failure of liberal institutions, and I think that is the key. I think if you want to have this more robust defense of liberalism, the institutions within, so just this country, British institutions, they have to rediscover their sense of purpose. They have to discover their sense of leadership. I mean, even the concept of leadership now is a very kind of, it's almost a kind of a nasty concept. But I think, and that's why the book really talks about the universities and the centrality and the importance of the universities returning to, however imperfect that those values may be, pluralism, open inquiry, the support of these processes, and not imposing new orthodoxies, because minimally, wherever we're at, allowing that free inquiry, wherever it may go, allowing that free inquiry, not persecuting people, not castigating people, not putting people out of the moral community if they dare to challenge the dominant orthodox and ideology, which is what we're seeing all the time on British campuses now. It's a very strong thing. So I think that those things are those values and the rediscovery of the telos of our institutions, especially the universities, is super important. We cannot allow those values to be lost, and that's also partly why there's myself and a few others have worked on the academic freedom legislation, just to sort of create this beachhead upon which we can return or try and defend these values. So whichever way it goes, these are fundamental to Western civilization.
So just to go to our final question, and I think that this is, I think one of the most insightful and important contributions of the book actually is this question of the relationship between um, woke and its impact on uh, the West on the world stage. And so, could you just elaborate on what you think the most corrosive impact of it is, and what that's really doing?
Well, I think the most corrosive impact is in some senses this desire to repudiate Western civilization itself and to see history in a very simplistic way, where all history, British history, I'll stick to Britain, we can talk about others, but Britain is just one long litany of oppression, slavery, empire, and colonialism. And I think what that does, ironically, is it's a form of Eurocentric narcissism. And it's we are the baddies, and it's a way of almost attracting attention to yourself. We're the worst, and it puts you center stage again in a weird kind of way. And I think that's extraordinarily patronizing, because what it does ultimately, not only is it simplistic historically in terms of its view of non-Western peoples, non-Western histories, and the agency and the dignity of that in some senses, and the complicated nature of that. But it also it kind of so it's kind of it's a false history. It's a false history, uh, and and I think it's unfair. And I think that what it does in the present day, it's operationalized in the present day to undermine the confidence of Western civilization. And I think that's quite a dangerous thing, because if you want to ultimately cobble or hobble or kneecap the capacity for action, and you want to undermine the moral confidence. I mean, if you think about morale in an army, you know, is a very important thing, but morale in a population is also very important, and that's based on a belief in oneself, a belief in one's righteousness. We're on the right side of history. We're doing the right thing. Um, so the undermining of that in the context of the rise of highly illiberal, highly authoritarian civilizational states, we're seeing it, for example, in Russia, in Ukraine. We're seeing it with the rise of China. We're even seeing it now. I mean, oddly enough, anti-colonial and post-colonial and decolonial theorists that are supporting Hamas. Now, the left has historically been, the decolonial left has historically supported more secular nationalist forces, especially in the Arab world. But a lot of that stuff's now morphed and become kind of highly Islamist. So when you're supporting this political spirituality of organizations like Hamas, independent of the atrocities that they've committed or they do commit, these are highly illiberal, bigoted. So if you're a progressive, an alleged progressive, believing in gender equality, racial equality, equality of all before the law, the rights of gay people, the rights of oppressed minorities, and you're supporting organizations like Hamas, who are, utterly illiberal and against those values and will kill you. I mean, look, for example, at some of the human rights reports in relation to the Gaza Strip, what's happened to young gay men or gender equality. But to see these people as somehow harbingers of a progressive future. So the
Mm,
point I make in that chapter is that in the absence of the West, which is very progressive, you're not going to get when you decolonize the West. You're not going to get the outburst of a wonderful utopia. What you're going to get is what you've had throughout most of human history, and that is tribalism and international conflict and alternative empires,
mm,
alternative civilizational projects, that will seek to colonize, and the values of those projects are often highly problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, as the point that you alluded to, you end up with immense moral confusion because you end up justifying and apologizing for
Yeah,
horrific acts
yeah,
because you perceive it to be anti-Western, which is something that they support, anything that's
yeah,
anti-Western. And
yeah.
I think that's a really important point. I guess what do we do? Because as I said earlier, you know, people can stand up for liberal ideals, but we need more people. Is there enough? Is there enough people? There's groups and there's organizations and there's thinkers like yourself that have really, burst onto the scene and are undoubtedly shaping and influencing the public conversation. But is that enough? Is my final question.
Wow, that's a big one. I don't know. I think that what we need to do is minimally, I think we need to realize that what we have is pretty good and pretty special. And we should, like a baby, cherish it more and learn more about the history of it, but the history in all of its complexities. And this simple binary of good and evil, Western evil and the non-Western world's good, the castigation of industrialization, capitalism is inherently wrong and evil and malign. All these things, just look at some of the data, some of the metrics on human development, look at some of the metrics on the international conflict, and just to get a more rounded sense of things. And then once you do that, one hopes that you can begin to appreciate how precious what we have is and wish to defend it more. And also there's a lot of people that I guess feel the same way as me, I suspect you too. It's the majority of people. People tend to be very decent, good people. You know, they want the best for everybody. They abhor discrimination, etc. Right? So, but I think just stand up and be counted more. There are a few people that have stood up and come out and pushed for legislative change and institutional change, but they've taken the slings and arrows of that. I mean, look at Kathleen Stock, for example, and others. They've taken the slings and arrows of those moves. But more people need to stand up and be counted. Otherwise, we are. The final point I want to make is this: I'm a very optimistic person by nature, but I do think we're going into a new phase, an inflection in the international system. We're seeing it now. So I think we need to really rediscover ourselves and our sense of unity in the face of what may come.
Thank you so much, Doug Stokes, for joining me. Buy this fantastic book, Against Decolonisation, Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anaya. It's been an absolute pleasure.